Hello and welcome back to Parley. This prompt was written by Just Rusty. Hope you'll enjoy listening. It's about the difficulty of difficulty modifiers, making difficulty modifiers. Sort of a follow-up, Just Rusty begins, to your response to my October Parley. We might come back to starting modifiers and loadouts for games, but you also talked about the difficulty of making good difficulty modifiers. Let's discuss what we've learned from all of the varying methods of difficulty adjustment games use and contrast them to any games you think do difficulty well or poorly. I think big talking points are granular opt-in challenge options, the Supergiant method, adaptive difficulty, games like Resident Evil 4 or Left 4 Dead's Director. We'll talk about directors too. Starting difficulty, the typical easy, standard, hard, insane model, and ascension modes, the typical roguelike approach which we've discussed before, like you beat the game and then you have to beat the game harder, basically. Often with some other benefits or detriments. As well as any other interesting alternatives you've seen, as well as games that just have a flat difficulty everyone is intended to play at. What are the strengths and weaknesses of each, in your opinion? Oh yeah, let's add flat as a category. But yeah, those four, and I'll talk about them, I'll give examples of them too. Just Rusty, you said, I'd also like to discuss whether having these options being something you can game is good or bad. When we reviewed Transistor, I thought the fact that you could game the system by piling a lot of difficulty modifiers on for easy fights to get extra experience, and then removing them for big boss fights was a gameplay loop that felt like it worsened the game. And I'll pause there and we'll get back to that. I think it's better to talk about these first. Great. Simple, really elegant idea for a parlay. Just different difficulty models and their different merits. Fantastic. So let's just talk about what they all are first, and then get back to some benefits and detriments of each of them. So starting with, I'm going to start with the starting difficulty one. That's what you called it. This is the, as you said, kind of the typical thing. You've got your, easy, normal, hard, harder is usually 3 or 4, and it's usually those, kind of a neutral one, and then you can go one easier and 1 or 2 harder. Often these systems will also include some kind of permadeath thing, where like if you die once, your save file gets deleted or something. That's often part of that model. So kind of modes as well. What exactly the difference is between those difficulties, I think, is a really interesting object of discussion, but I think that discussing the other ways you can do difficulty will reveal, part of the weakness there. But yeah, basically just the idea is that there are more enemies or better enemy AI, or enemies will use a tactic that is better or have a better ability, or just have more health and damage, or less of those things in the other one. Another really, really common thing to do in these starting difficulty things is to have it be that how you heal is better or worse if you turn the difficulty up. It's really interesting that that one is common. For example, in Baldur's Gate 3, you have more HP, which sounds like, does that really make it easier? But it does, because it means that getting caught out in a bad position and getting a lot of damage piled onto you doesn't result in you dying before your turn comes back up again as easily, basically. So even though it seems like that wouldn't be a very elegant approach, these options, as much as it's a very simple approach, it sounds kind of lazy. I think it's good. It is intellectual to not be distracted by that. Often it's surprisingly elegant and it really fits the game's design. We will definitely come back to that point. So adaptive difficulty, let's talk about that. The idea here basically is that some games, quite famously Resident Evil 4, at least in my experience, that's the one people know of this in, but a lot of other games do this, will quietly scale the difficulty up or down in the background. And other forms of adaptive difficulty could not be a secret. It could be something like, the more points of capacity you use up on your build, the more build pieces you use, the harder the difficulty of the enemies. And I even recall an example from somebody during a stream in chat who mentioned Kid Icarus Uprising, I think is the game, where the more build points you use, like the more stuff you use in your build, the more points you're worth if you're killed, and the less, the less. So if you use only 1 out of 8, let's say, points on your build, and you get killed 8 times by somebody who has an 8 out of 8 build, but then you kill them 1 time, the score is even, because killing them is worth 8 times as much, is the idea. That doesn't sound like it would be that balanced in reality to me, but that's a really interesting idea, isn't it? I'll have to play that at some point. But those are examples. Adaptive difficulty doesn't have to be secret necessarily, though I think that is like a big one. Another example, and you talked about Left 4 Dead's director. I'm not familiar, but the concept of directors I think is useful here. This is usually a subsystem in a game that assigns resources to make the game difficult. The one I'm familiar with is Risk of Rain 2. So as the game gets more difficult, the director gets more like points, which is programmed to spend at regular intervals to spawn enemies, and maybe it has a chance to buy a stronger enemy with those points as the game's difficulty goes on. You can then have this director with an adaptive difficulty model. You can have this director be given less or more points, either automatically, depending on how well the player does. Player has a good hit rate and a low time to kill, so the director gets more points, or it can just be the player uses more build resources, give the director more points, something like that. Very cool. They would frequently be used in other games, but yeah, directors are a useful concept for that adaptive difficulty. Okay, granular difficulty. This is like the Supergiant thing, though other studios have done this. But yes, pretty much all the Supergiant games have this idea. This is the idea that you kind of build a difficulty out of pieces. So the game will offer you. I like to think of this as just an inverse build system. You craft the enemy difficulty, and then you can take it in whatever direction you want. So in Hades, for example, but I think literally all of the Supergiant games do this. Before you jump out the door to begin your run in Hades, you get a little board that has modifiers for enemies that make them stronger, do more damage, have more health, attack faster, move faster, more enemies, stronger types of enemies, etc. And you can pick and choose and set up the difficulty, and if you increase it enough, you get a chance at better rewards. You're guaranteed better rewards if you don't die. And other Supergiant games have done this in different ways. I think that the key thing for granular options is exactly how they increase the difficulty. That is it just a matter of increasing different qualities for the enemies? It is basically just like a build system, but for enemies. Or is it something where you add unique effects to enemies? You basically make your own game mode, but that makes the game more challenging in various ways. That's a little bit more like the Titan stars in Pyre. You activate unique constellations, and then that turns on certain abilities or difficulty modifiers or restrictions when you play. It's very similar, but I think that one feels more like you're adding kind of a slightly new twist on gameplay. Some of them are simple, like you have to win your fantasy basketball match, that is what Pyre is, by more points, essentially. You start with less and they start with more. But there are a lot of them that are, more complicated than that. The enemies are way faster, or, I don't know if this is actually one, but it would be things like you only get 2 out of 3 players and they get 3 out of 3 players. So while those might be basically the same system, there is definitely a variant of that granular options, which is like mini game modes, a little bit related to the starting difficulty one. If you've got one of those options that is permadeath, or you have an option you can add to any of them that is permadeath, that is also a little bit similar to the granular difficulty method. Cool. The ascension levels thing. So this I'm familiar with, in games where you do a run and then you might win and then you unlock or proceed to a higher difficulty, potentially. Sometimes the game lets you directly loop. You win the run with a certain set of upgrades, and you can make it harder and start at the beginning again, but keep what you had sometimes. Often there's kind of a trade-off as well, like in Snakers, SNKRX. I don't know what to call that game, but that's how it's spelled. SNKRX. Your snake has a defined length. It's basically a tower defense game, but your tower defense turrets are a snake that you pilot around. And at the end of a run, if you win, you can increase the max length of your snake by 1, but the enemies get harder the next time. They don't get immediately harder. You go back to the beginning and it's easy for a while. But, the max difficulty has increased. I don't think that one is balanced that well, but it's just an example. And a lot of the time it doesn't work this way. You turn on difficulty modifiers or ramp them up as you go, and then that, increases the intensity of your run. A noteworthy example to me is Chrono Arc. So the way Chrono Arcs works, if I understand correctly anyway, is that each time you hit a checkpoint, so you finish zone 1, zone 2, zone 3, etc. At your campfire, where you heal up and upgrade people and recruit new people and stuff between each segment of the run, you can turn up the difficulty like one more tick. So if you want to do the max difficulty, you turn it up once at every campfire. And if you turn it up and then it's a little bit too hot, then you can just not turn it up when you get to the next campfire. An interesting version of the system. So it could be that you just start a run at a certain difficulty tier, basically like the starting options thing. But a lot of the time it's some kind of, it is somewhat granular. You sort of turn them on as you go. And I think another distinction of these ascension options, in my experience, is that they often are like a positive and a negative. You increase the intensity of the run, usually making it harder, but also potentially making you more powerful in exchange. So to me, that is like one of the distinguishing factors there. Although I don't think that one is that unique. Like, I feel like it is similar to the others. I hope I'm not understanding it differently than you are, but what can you do? And then flat difficulty. There are games where there aren't difficulty options. I think you often find this in games where the design doesn't really allow you to tweak the difficulty without fundamentally changing the experience, or you could do that, but because it would fundamentally change the experience, the developers don't really feel like the rest of the game sort of holds up to that. For example, Dark Souls is a really famous example of a game that people cite as like, it's this difficulty, this is the difficulty. I actually am not enough of a fanatic about these games to know if they actually all don't have difficulty modifiers, but anyway, very well. And I think that it's an understandable fit. They want it to be a game where you've got these RPG systems, you can build your character's stats and stuff. You can potentially grind to get more powerful, I don't know. But they want it to be a game where you are footseeing with bosses and dodge rolling while you wait for your opportunity to strike. That's it's basic intent of the gameplay loop. And you could think of it as, well, if they allowed you to make things easier by doing something like let you heal more, or make the enemies slower, or make the enemies do less damage, or give you more health, this would be kind of the reverse of the Baldur's Gate 3 example I gave before. It would change the fundamental nature of the game into something you might find fun, but something unarguably different at that point. Whereas, interestingly, doing the same thing in Baldur's Gate 3 doesn't, I would argue, change the fundamental mechanics of the game. It just makes it forgiving in a certain clever way. Okay, so I would say a takeaway just from that analysis is difficulty types, or like approaches to difficulty like this, are surprisingly not very similar even between the same game implementing them. If you take what seems like the starting difficulty approach and you apply it to Baldur's Gate 3, or imagine applying it to Dark Souls, weirdly, that doesn't do the same thing in most ways you would apply it. The design basically dictates what that difficulty model does. And that is going to be my thesis for the rest of the parlay, that these difficulty models are things that modify the game design that is there. They are mirrors or extensions of the game design that's already present. They work well if they're a good fit for that game design, and if the game design itself was good to begin with. Games that have a lot of difficulty options that are all wonkily balanced, I would suggest that it's more a problem further downstream with another part of the game, because the difficulty options just kind of put pressure on those aspects of the game's design. Chosen wisely, I think difficulty options can be surprisingly easy to implement, as long as the rest of the game, I mean, the part that's not easy is you had to make the rest of the game really good, I guess. So, for example, I think in Baldur's Gate 3, the difficulty options are quite good, which is a little surprising. They're not very complicated, they're not very robust. I didn't use them that much personally. I played on Tactician almost the entire time, and I thought it was a little too easy, but I'm a big nerd about that game, and I multi-classed, Geneva Convention violating level of builds. So I don't think that really, my opinion about that really matters that much, but I had a lot of friends who played, and they all used a colorful variety of those difficulty options, and I played with them during a lot of those. And I tried to kind of power down builds in some of those cases to sort of simulate, I guess, what it would be like. So, for example, one of my four, I think, playthroughs of Baldur's Gate 3 was with someone who played on I don't remember what the easiest difficulty is called, where you get more HP. and they did not multiclass. So when I played, I also restricted myself to not multiclass. Now, it's not that simple. We don't have time in this parlay for it, but I also did a few things like I think a single class cleric is like pretty brutal the way that Baldur's Gate 3 is balanced, so I just banned cleric for myself. I tried not to do anything blatantly broken. I tried to play like a niche member of the party character. Now, 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons systems, which is what Baldur's Gate 3 is built on, are not like balanced if you do that, but I tried my best. You understand what I'm trying to say. And it was a really interesting experience. Like, it did put me in a position where if I gave them all the, spicy gear or whatever, so I didn't have anything, super broken, I did feel the benefit of the safety net of that HP. It's not just me imagining for a player that was struggling, would that additional health then change the nature of the combat for? No, like it did. I saw that it did. At least for me and my playgroup. So it was interesting how that design worked so elegantly, because the level of your health, the balance of the monsters you're fighting, the action economy of the game is sufficiently well balanced that, those difficulty levels will work for most players. Not perfect. Again, personally, I feel like if you know the system like the back of your hand, no, it's not really very balanced. You can make a character with hilariously more action economy than others, but that's kind of my point, is that it's really that part of the game that dictates whether those balance options will work. Those difficulty options are going to be good or bad based on whether like that stuff is well made. And then you can relatively simply implement balance options. I would imagine it would be a living nightmare to take a game that isn't like great balanced to begin with, or doesn't have very linear balancing, where this effect is okay at this level, but if you give people 2 or 3 times more of this effect, then the game just gets broken. Then difficulty levels require you to manually rebalance certain abilities, and then it gets very difficult. So you see what I mean? If the basic system that the difficulty is going to be applied to is robustly made and adaptive, then it will be relatively easy to put on a seemingly very simple, overly simple, but surprisingly elegant difficulty system. So cool. I think that's kind of the primary thing. And that's why I'm going to go back first, as we talk about pros and cons, to the granular options one. And this will hook a little bit into your thing about gaming the system. I think the problem with the granular options one, in theory, is that it's very gameable, of course. And this is a problem a lot of them are going to have. All the difficulty options that are not like a starting difficulty, or the Ascension one to some extent, granular and adaptive difficulty can be very gameable. They can be very, very exploitable. And on the surface, this might not seem like a very good thing. For example, your example where in Transistor you can turn on a bunch of difficulty modifiers for easier fights, but because the game lets you turn them off between any fights, if you do something tedious, boring, but very beneficial, you get a lot more experience. I really want to break that point down because it's a big problem with those granular options, but I want to get to sort of the contents of it. You will hear people in the discourse on such subjects be quite reductive about this and say things like, oh, but that's just not fun, so you shouldn't do that. It's like, okay, but we're in game designer mode here. You don't have to be. I think Just Rusty is perfectly happy to be. But you, random person on the internet, who's saying, oh no, it doesn't matter because that's just not fun. Just don't do that. You don't have to be a game designer, but we're having a game design related discussion. I'm not talking about whether it's a problem for me, and I don't care whether it's a problem for you. You and I don't matter. We're talking about game design. And from a game design perspective, the game rewards you for getting experience. What's fun and rewarded in the combat of the game is leveling up and getting new abilities. You get more powerful, and it's fun. Transistor's build system is fun. You get to recombine abilities. Every ability is an upgrade and or an attack on its own, and you can use them to upgrade or as their own abilities, with other abilities turning into upgrades for them. It's cool. That modular system is meant to be what's driving you forward. The game intentionally provides a very strong incentive to get you to level up. So how the game gives you experience is the game's responsibility. It is not you, the player's responsibility, to not care about the reward the entire game is designed to make you want. No, that's the game's job. It is not a response to say, oh, but that's not fun, so you just shouldn't do it. You cannot do that, and that might make you have more fun. But in a critique of game design, that's disqualified. No, you shouldn't be able to do that, is the answer, very simply. However, I think it's that there are two kinds of gaming to some extent, two kinds of gaming the system. There's that one where, why is it bad? Well, it's bad because it's tedious. And if you look at it another way, I mean, if you can turn on all the difficulty modifiers for the easy fights and get a bunch of experience because the fights are too easy, should they just not be too easy? You know what I mean? Shouldn't you just give the player that difficulty level and that increased experience by default? And then the player not only doesn't want to tediously change up all their difficulty modifiers, they also just like, you can just make them not be allowed to. Part two, just make it so the player can't freely change their difficulty options. I don't know exactly how you do this in Transistor specifically, but it's interesting to note in Supergiant's catalog of games that, like in Hades and Hades 2, for example, you get that big board of difficulty modifiers to change, before you start a run, and then you can't change it at all during the run. In Pyre, as another example, you can change all of the options before each basketball match. Sounds like the same thing as the difficulty modifiers in Transistor. And so why isn't that a problem? I don't think that's an issue in Pyre. I think part of the reason is that it feels like part of the narrative in Pyre, and it feels like you're talking with the game about how challenging it is. So to explain this a little further, I think the merit of the granular options as a challenge mode is that they let the player talk with the game about the level of difficulty they're having and to adjust it. But that should be easy to do. It should be a natural, easy to do thing. Indeed, in Pyre, I would say the only bad thing is that it's kind of static. If you could just set up a set of difficulty modifiers you like and then leave it. And that's fine, but the system does become maybe a little static that way. Having certain stars light up or not before each match, you get certain difficulty options presented to you, and then you as the player can say, I think this match is going to be easy or hard for me, and therefore if it's easy, maybe I will take a chance and turn on those modifiers. It's hard, oh, but I randomly got served a modifier that isn't so bad, maybe I'll still risk it, stuff like that. And you could make an interesting system that would make sure the player was served some easy and some hard modifiers to choose from. Whereas in the example in Transistor, turning on and off all those difficulty modifiers is a chore constantly. It's just annoying to have to do. If the player could just hit a button that said, overload the transistor, and now, you get more experience, but enemies are harder, that could be enough to fix it. I think a big part of it is just the tedium of feeling like the game is telling me I'll be rewarded if I do this, but it's annoying to have to do it. It is good to prevent that, but that doesn't necessarily mean you have to make the player unable to game the system that way entirely. It might just be that making it really easy or more engaging in some way is enough. On the other hand, we have the example in games like Hades where you can build craft a difficulty modifier spread before you leave for a run in Hades that like your build counters, basically. So the classic example in Hades is that there's one difficulty modifier that gives enemies a shield, a light blue shield. This absorbs 1 hit of damage. Doesn't matter what it is, it absorbs 1 hit. For weapons that hit very rapidly, this is almost nothing. You almost don't even notice. It does practically nothing to make enemies tankier. It certainly doesn't do a lot against bosses most of the time. But for slower attacking weapons or builds that will hit in one glorious blow of big damage, it can be a huge pain. And so you can just not turn it on if you're using a weapon that lends itself to that type of build, you see. Now, I don't like that in Hades because there aren't other modifiers that kind of let you, favor or sort of cheat a little bit for weapons that hit in one big hit. An example of how you could make one of those would be make another difficulty modifier that makes enemies take a flat 5 less damage every time they get hit. This is bad for weapons that hit rapidly, but if you hit in one big blow, you barely reduce your damage at all. And that would be a counterpart to the other one, where they get a shield that absorbs infinite damage, but only for 1 hit. You see what I mean? And indeed, my only real complaint about that in Hades is that they didn't add a modifier like that. But I think that the player being able to game the system that way is not necessarily bad. I think the main bad thing a lot of people would perceive is that it makes it so a given heat modifier, that's what they're called in Hades, a given difficulty level, I guess, number of difficulty points you set up for yourself, isn't objective. You know, you beating heat level 20 doesn't really mean that much. Which heat level 20? You know, what modifiers to get to heat level 20? That difficulty can fluctuate wildly depending on what options you put. But I just don't think this matters that much. Like I'm not sure that's a big deal. Only a player that wants to feel better than other people and brag about their progress would care about that, and we don't have to make the game design for that player. We can just let people have fun, and if they want to feel clever, they can. If they want to put on difficulty modifiers that are not necessarily easier or harder, but are just the ones they prefer the experience of, they can. If you want to make difficulty modifiers that you feel like are more objective, because that's just the style you prefer, you don't like to change them up, and you like to focus on your build with a kind of set level of difficulty, but you get to do a little game design to kind of fiddle with it, that's what I prefer. Great, the game lets you do that. I think that that's the strength of this form of difficulty modifiers. So to some extent, I want the player to be able to game it, but not to the point that it becomes kind of a game onto itself to fiddle with it, if that makes sense. I want it to be easy and intuitive for the player to say. Ideally, the player can just say, this is my intent, and then the system very, very easily, very little effort, translates that intent into difficulty modifiers for the player. I think that's the merit of these granular systems, and it becomes a problem when that's tedious to do, literally just takes a lot of time to do, when the player has been incentivized to gain something by doing something really boring with the game's difficulty modifiers. That's just annoying. It can be as simple as it's tedious to swap them in and out. Literally just having a button where you overload the transistor and get all the difficulty modifiers on would be cool. You could even add a little drawback like that. You make it really easy to do that if the player wants to, but in exchange, the player has to turn all of them on. You know, you have to turn every single one on. You not only don't have to tediously activate and deactivate all of them, you also take the risk that, oh, you're feeling confident, are you? You know, then bam, we turn on the difficulty. So I think that's an interesting idea. I feel like this granular system has a lot of potential, and a lot of the places where in the Supergiant video games it's kind of a issue are actually just growing pains. You know, the system can totally accommodate those issues and be just good, but it, you know, I suppose the drawback, and we'll get into it as the advantage of the other systems, is that it's not very straightforward, but I feel like in a lot of the Supergiant games, it's not a huge deal because you already need to make build-like decisions. Is it really that big of a deal to have the Mirror of Night and then the Pact of Punishment? You make positive benefit builds for yourself with the Mirror of Night in Hades, and then you use the Pact of Punishment to granular difficulty build craft difficulty modifiers for yourself. It seems fine. The player that would have liked this game anyway is kind of already doing that to some extent. You know, I feel like making the systems parallel is a good idea. You know, make them look similar, feel similar. But yeah, sure, for a game that doesn't otherwise have a lot of granular options like that, I think the good psychology is to not include a system that asks the player for massive amounts of agency and decision making if the game like otherwise doesn't ask for that kind of thing at all. There's no other build systems, for example, in the game. And then you put in granular difficulty options, it's like, was the game trying to attract a kind of player that would like this? No, I don't think. And so I think the main, not drawback, but limitation of granular options is that I kind of want them in a game that is already about that, if that makes sense. Okay. Adaptive difficulty, way simpler in my opinion. It's just really abusable. You encourage the player, if they're aware that Resident Evil 4 will make things easier if they do worse, to like do worse, to do artificially worse. I think this is the place where the gaming the system is at its worst. I actually want to read the second part of your gaming the system thing. You said I'm also currently not pushing through the Ascension track on Against the Storm, as it's let me keep Ascension low in areas where typically you have to be above a certain Ascension for progression into certain areas, but the game will lock to one step above your previous win, allowing an easier attempt at my first run of the game's hardest challenge. Wow, easy for me to say. I think having these loopholes is typically a mistake, but I'm willing to be talked into a different view. Oh no, I don't think I'm going to be convincing you. Yes, I largely think that that form of gaming the system is really bad. And again, I think you'll find that the community, the discourse in general on this subject is really like reductive and poor. Players tend to say, "Oh, but like you just shouldn't do that though." And it's like, okay, but why is the game built around rewarding you for doing that? Well, I won't rehash the discussion we had before. So personally, I think that games that have the kind of classic Resident Evil adaptive difficulty, that is just a mistake. Like in 2025, you can't ever not like look up that kind of thing ever again. You know, you have to be an ascetic who doesn't ever look at use the internet. It's not even use social media. I don't use any social media except browsing YouTube the amount that gets me to the entertainment I like, and that's a giant, very useful source of free entertainment. And like browsing Steam, if that counts as using a social network. I don't have Instagram or Facebook or anything. I don't use any social networks. I use the minimum amount of social network. But I still see tons of this stuff. So you cannot not be aware of it. You have to inefficiently live under a rock to not be aware that these systems exist. You can't just like not know that the difficulty adapts itself to your skill level. Now, you might happen to not know. I'm just saying, as a design idea, you, the developer, are leaving up to chance that the player won't know. The player doesn't become aware that the difficulty adapts to them by looking it up, by seeking it out. The player will likely become aware of that without trying to become aware of it. That's not hard to have happen. Not every player will know, but it's very common for players to know, even if they avoid looking it up. So personally, I feel like this is reductive, but a simple answer would be that is obsolete now. You know, you kind of can't do that type of thing. Very much in the same vein that older games would have, you know, you had to shoot or step on the unmarked identical tile in the room, this specific one out of all these identical looking tiles that opened up a secret passage. Like back in the day, if you couldn't look that up, that could be not only infuriating, you would just get trapped and there's no way at all to know where it is, but also, I mean, it could take a very long time. You know, you could see it as a form of challenge. And some people said they have good memories of swapping notes about that, like on the bus or whatever. The thing is, like, just because you had a good human experience because of that, does that really mean it's good game design? And I think that in the information age 2025 that we're in now, it's revealed that, yeah, that's not really viable. Like in the first place, even if you don't look up spoilers for that, it's pretty easy to just know, to just become aware, because putting that type of thing in incentivizes players to brag on social media to millions of people, not just on the bus with their one friend. And therefore, the entire internet is designed to make it so you don't not know this kind of thing. And you will never be ignorant of the pressure that you could always look up that information. To me, this is kind of the Remnant 2 problem. If the game has a bunch of little secrets everywhere, and I know it has a bunch of little secrets everywhere, and it's really easy to look up what they are, and I know I'm missing build stuff that I want if I don't look them up, you've basically decided that the player has to look up, you know, everything every single time. Again, I won't coddle you, audience, but for the last time, I'll repeat, this is not about whether I or anyone had a problem with this. I'm just saying the game rewards that behavior, and so if it's tedious, I think that's bad. What exactly you do if you're a human being that likes to find secrets hidden in games, but we live in the information age where it's basically impossible to not just look them up all the time, I mean, I don't know. Like, I don't have an answer for that. But I do personally feel like a simple evaluation is, yeah, you would need to get a little bit clever with your game design. So straightforwardly, adaptive difficulty in the automatic sense, I personally think is just like the time has passed. Like, don't do that. It's really very easy for people to find out and become kind of haunted, I guess is the way I'd describe it by that. However, having a sort of director manage the game's resources is a very different matter, of course. And there could be ways in which you can make the adaptive difficulty kind of more clever. Like we can't get into it fully here. But I gave the examples before where I would consider things like the amount of the build system you use increases the difficulty to be a form of adaptive difficulty that is like a system that you play around with. A little bit similar to the granular, you know, kind of thing. but it can create its own incentives in its own way. If the game tells you, oh, you're worth more points if you're killed, if you have this or that build thing, what you're encouraged to do is look for a breakpoint, a combination of upgrades in the build system or whatever, or, an amount of guns in your first-person shooter loadout that covers your bases and no more. Leaves maybe an opening, but it's kind of a good trade-off in some way. I've thought about builds like that all the time in lots of games, and many games just don't reward that type of thing, both from a build making perspective and also just you as a player. It can be a lot of fun to go guns blazing with your one pistol and that's it, and you have nothing else. That's kind of a fun, novel gameplay experience, but a lot of games design doesn't really reward it. So adaptive difficulty will get a little star or a note from me here. I think that this has a lot of potential, but the straightforward implication where the game just automatically adapts to like how good you shoot, I think is just bluntly a bad idea. Just don't. But I hate to be so reductive. Again, we could do another parlay sometime about, the game basically like haunting you with a piece of information related to that Remnant 2 example as well. Okay, starting difficulty. Pretty obvious now that we've set up the granular and adaptive benefits and detriments at length. I mean, it's simple, right? You didn't wait 35 minutes in this parlay for me to say that. We all know the benefit of the starting difficulty thing is it's simple. Like, it's easy for the player to decide on a method. And so sure, you do often see this in games where the game itself is pretty straightforward. You're not going to do granular difficulty because the player's not being asked to build craft stuff. So you do this one, right? Well, but simplicity is a virtue in a way, and so it's really nice to have a game like Baldur's Gate 3 with all these crunchy systems you're going to have to dig around through and move your build system parts around. It's really nice to have an elegant, simple, crispy build system like that in there. So I don't necessarily think that's bad. There's also a really large category of games, in my mind, that kind of have the flat difficulty option, but they have like a challenge mode of some kind. Often sort of hidden, or it's like not a major feature of the game. An example would be Disco Elysium. In the options menu, there is like a hardcore detective mode hidden in there as kind of a side thing. These are usually in experiences where the design kind of wants a flat difficulty option. You kind of can't modulate the difficulty that much, or there's no point in modulating the difficulty that much. In Disco Elysium, you failing at a check doesn't necessarily mean that's bad. It's just how the story is told. It doesn't often result in a game over. You just it goes badly. There are plenty of examples early in Disco Elysium where something going poorly benefits you tremendously. So it's not like about you failing, and therefore straightforward difficulty options are kind of out. They're just not part of the design. Failing, to some extent, isn't part of the design. And yet there are forms of fail states in the game. And so they offered a mode where that's, the screws are tightened on that a lot. As a kind of first-party mod, I think that's also interesting. And again, I brought up the idea of like a permadeath mode in here as well. At best, I think the starting difficulty is, simple, easy to use, but offers a lot of flexibility for what kind of experience do you, the player, want. Many people smarter than me have talked about this before, but I also think the names of the starting difficulty options are vital. There's a lot of little tricks to make starting difficulties better. The obvious one that you've probably noticed, and I hinted at earlier, is to not make the default difficulty be the lowest difficulty. Have there be a difficulty below that, because having it feel like you turn the difficulty down is almost more important than actually turning the difficulty down. There are players who would persevere in a game if they knew they'd already turned the difficulty down and it's meant to be easy. I wouldn't want a player to feel bad if they found that difficult. These things are all subjective. It's fine if you have difficulty with it. But for many people, I think it will have a positive effect. Them turning down the difficulty will make them feel like they've set it up for success for themselves, and then maybe they'll persevere when they wouldn't have otherwise. I know plenty of people who are very defeatist about difficulty levels when they're often not. It doesn't work like that. It's math. I will also just note this isn't really a benefit or detriment to starting difficulties, and in a way I'm kind of comparing every other difficulty type to starting difficulties. But I wanted to mention that I think there's a subsection here for games that use the difficulties as a progression system. And so it's kind of actually the Ascension type of difficulty, but it just doesn't telegraph that at the start. For example, in Remnant 2, The difficulties are kind of the standard model. You start at 2 out of 4, and there's one lower than that, and there's two higher than that. And they're called like, whatever, I don't know what the easy one is called, Veteran, Nightmare, and Apocalypse difficulty. Now, Nightmare and Apocalypse difficulty sound like sweaty, try-hard game modes. But the way that Remnant 2's build systems and progression works is that by the time you finished a full run of a campaign for the first time, a lot of players will be at a level where statistically they will overpower the easier parts of Nightmare difficulty. They're actually mostly progression systems. And I would argue that if you're the worst player on Earth at dodging attacks, but you have a good build and it's leveled and stuff, Nightmare difficulty can be made almost an automatic win if you use everything at your disposal. Now, that's not realistic for many people. They will still be using some skill. But I was skeptical of this when it was brought up by one of you during a stream. But indeed, I've had that experience now. You can make it such that you can basically stand still and you will be able to win if you use the stats that you have access to. I feel like games making this clear would help. In Remnant 2, there's a little thing that says not recommended for beginners. And it's like, okay, but really it's like you should be fully geared. And, I think it might even say like for fully geared players or something. It's not that you could play it and just have it be a hard mode right out of the gate. But the idea that it isn't a set level of difficulty because the game's difficulty is kind of a moving target is definitely meaningful as well. Anyway, the Ascension difficulties. Yeah, I don't like these. I'm not really sure why, breaking down the formula. Looking at the things we've talked about so far, I guess my problem is that where the starting difficulties are elegant and simple, and the granular difficulty feels kind of interactive, Ascension feels like a weird midpoint that doesn't really do it for me, I guess. I often feel like I don't have enough choice, or like the challenge modifier added next is just not compelling to me a lot of the time, or I don't want that challenge modifier. And so because that's the game's only way of giving you more difficulty, you've made a kind of more linear, granular difficulty mode. And so if I don't like the next difficulty addition, then I just can't use the system, basically. I'm not a fan, and I think that's why. At their best, though, these can introduce mechanics that are kind of meant to be a part of the game in a linear sequence. And I've certainly played games like that before, where being restricted by the ladder of Ascension difficulty modifiers is kind of a like teaching tool or like a late tutorial of sorts. This is an interesting idea. I have a suggestion. The Ascension modifiers are already kind of, you've got to have the initiative. What about letting the player also do a granular or adaptive difficulty modifier at the same time? So they feel like if it's too easy for them, they want it to be harder, but they don't want to add that effect. They have a way to do that. But then the ultimate way forward is to kind of add that difficulty modifier. The player then has the option to sort of lower the difficulty generally, but then add that difficulty option back on. So maybe another difficulty system would kind of mesh with it well. But the ones I've played, if we're talking about the same thing, I have issue with. I feel like they're kind of the worst of both worlds of starting difficulty modifiers and granular difficulty modifiers. And then what? Adaptive, I basically just kicked out, but I think it has a lot of potential. And flat difficulty modifiers are, in my opinion, kind of a subset of starting difficulty. And it's usually dictated by the design, in my opinion anyway. So an interesting topic. You did ask for specifics like outside of this model, and I can't think of any. I think you did a good job making categories, if you want to say. If anything, you could make the argument that some of these are kind of fused, or that it's like a spectrum of sorts, or that adaptive difficulty is kind of a different type or category of game design idea. But I have no real issue with the way you organized it. Definitely, I feel like being put on the spot. If I had any small example, that's been frustrating. I just want to kind of double down on the recommendation for multiple forms of difficulty modifiers, because this has been a problem in other games that I've seen before as well. For example, in Nier Automata, there's an easy mode that lets you use auto chips. These allow you to put something in your build. It takes a build space, so it's kind of a trade-off, but they're cheap to use, usually. and they automatically perform some or up to all of the functions of the game. You can basically make your character automatically fight, or just automate some parts of the combat. Now, I, like a lot of people who play video games a lot and effectively work in an office in 2025, have some wrist pain. And so what I wanted is to automatically fire my pod's weapon, because there's absolutely no disadvantage to doing that 100% of the time. But there just isn't a way to make it automatically fire unless you make the whole difficulty easy mode. Do you see what I mean? Those things should be separate. I guess that's where I'm going with this. And then the auto chips become a vector of difficulty you can adjust. But I want to have a lot of fun playing the game where you automatically fire your pod, because I almost feel like you shouldn't even need to manually fire your pod. I mean, there's a kinesthetic benefit, but anyway, but I get to play the harder difficulty otherwise. The result is that to have a good experience, I bounced between being annoyed at my wrist pain and manually firing my pod on, like, it wasn't even normal difficulty. I think I had it on hard. So that was the difficulty that was comfortable for me, although not for my wrist. Eye roll. And then I would swap back to all the way down to easy I had to go, making combat a complete joke, but saving me the wrist pain. This just seems like a really simple mistake. Like that, I don't think that type of thing should be a difficulty modifier, I guess, is where I'm going with that. And certainly automating some parts of the game. I mean, at the harder difficulties, I would imagine you could pretty easily make an automating mode that would just die at the harder difficulties. You see what I mean? And so can't you make those systems merry and play nice? Nier Automata being a game that I think is amazing at like 90% of its stuff, and then falls short only in its build system. This really disappointed me. They've kind of weirdly woven a difficulty thing into that part of the build system, but then it kind of holds back an ergonomics feature as well. Yeah, that's bad for no clear reason. Like, just let people use those. I don't know. So again, that's the kind of thing you just do like a patch on someone's coffee break, and that'd be fixed. So I think that's a shame. Definitely, I feel like there's potential in combining these, is I guess where I'm going with that. The Ascension modifiers being a linear ladder has its advantages. Again, having it be a sort of introduction to steadily pulling the player deeper into game mechanics is an interesting idea. But if it roadblocks the player because they don't want that difficulty modifier, I think that that's bad. And you could maybe get around that by giving the player another way to adjust difficulty or progress. I guess the drawback of the Ascension one is that it's stiff, would be the way to summarize that. And maybe combining it with another one would be good. But overall, I don't know. I really like when the player has like a relationship with the difficulty, though. I think a lot of people like the purism of the game has one difficulty. But I will leave you with, as a question for you all to think about your own opinions about difficulty. Do people like having one monolithic difficulty for a reason other than to say, I cleared this challenge, which I think means I'm valuable as a person or something? Like, I consider that to be valuable, but is it? Is a standard difficulty valuable for a reason other than bragging, basically, is what I'm saying? Because I can't think of one. Why would... We're not all that similar in terms of our abilities with these things and comfort levels with these things. Why would it mean anything for us to have the same level of challenge? Why is that not even good? Just like, why is that anything? Like, that's an illusion, even if it feels like we all cleared the same challenge. We sort of didn't. And so is that not just immature to value that? I'm not trying to be facetious. I honestly do not yet see any other benefit to that. So I don't know, the flat one, I hate to give so little time, but I hope I've at least provided a tableau of what I think about the group of them. I think one last interesting thing that is kind of outside the scope of these difficulty modifiers, but which I think is interesting, is going further with the idea of the player making their own difficulty, like the things that they pick in the game. I'm stuck on build systems, give me a break. Adjust what the player encounters, not necessarily in terms of how many they use. Like, if the player uses a sniper rifle as their weapon, well, they can attack enemies from far away. What if you populate the game with more snipers? they have a way to hit them. You know they have a way to hit them because they picked the sniper rifle. So the challenge changes. I don't know if that's really different, but shifting challenge rather than difficulty levels is also another place I would love to go further with this topic at some point. I think that's a really underused aspect of game design, even going as far into things like when I play D&D with my play group. I try really hard to run player characters against them. I don't always follow the exact rules, but I try very hard. I prefer the fun that way, so I try very hard to keep them very honest, balanced player characters. Not for every encounter, but like they fight people like that a lot. And it's really common advice to avoid doing that when you game master tabletop role playing games. And I think that that's wrong. I think it's very fun and beneficial to do that. And part of it is that it feels like the players know what the challenge is. It was kind of handcrafted either against them or like this build was trying to do something. This person in the world set up to do this thing really well. And now, it's their wits against yours, sort of. That can be very fun, having the challenge feel personalized. And I think it can often be really easy. Again, that example with the sniper, just give the director more credits for ranged enemies. The player picks a melee weapon, well, give the director more credits for melee enemies, things like that. I think it can be really fun for a surprisingly low effort. So I think that's an underused approach. Thanks to the parlay. I'm looking forward to getting back to these. I know I'm on a bit of a backlog, but I'm catching up rapidly now. If you'd like your own, you can do that using a link in the description. Love to have you with us. For now, I'll say looking forward to the next one.